I don't know of anything else that shapes your thinking more than the question, is there a God? Now, obviously, there are other questions that will follow if you answer in the affirmative, the question of which God and how do we know which one. But for now, I want to deal with the flip side of it. And the reason I deal with the flip side of it is because the atheists often assume that the theist is the only one that has to give all the answers, that they can just raise the questions. It's not true. They have to find some answers as well. I remember in the 1980s, during my graduate studies, in that period of time, 70s and 80s, spending endless hours reading the atheistic philosopher Anthony Flew. We were taught to understand Flew, to read everything Flew had written, to get at the core of his argument, and somehow try to respond to the questions he was raising, whether truth is knowable, whether truth is verifiable, if language about truth and logic really has any reflection on reality, all these things. Little did I know that about 30 years later, he would renounce his atheism. So here I was in graduate school studying Flew, only to find out a year ago, Flew has flown the coop. He no longer considers atheism tenable. Now, he's not yet come all the way. He's in the halfway mark of deism, and he also makes the comment very clearly that if there is a God, it would have to be the God of the Christian faith. And his studies on the writings of N.T. Wright and the resurrection, he goes on record as saying, this is the most persuasive thing I've read, a combination of N.T. Wright and C.S. Lewis. I would never have known, reading in the 60s, the writings of Jean-Paul Sartre, that on his deathbed, the atheist existentialist philosopher, Sartre, would say he could no longer trust himself as an atheistic thinker because he found it didn't just fit together. One of the most hedonistic writers who ever lived was Oscar Wilde. I wrote a book on an imaginary conversation between Wilde and Jesus in a book I wrote called Sense and Sensuality. Jesus talks to Oscar Wilde. I remember in my time of research, going into London and then into Paris, walking into the very church where his funeral was held. And interestingly enough, there wasn't a sound or a note of music in Oscar Wilde's funeral. This man was a hedonist. No music at his funeral. There's a little twist to it all. In the same church that Oscar Wilde had his funeral, in the back of the church hangs the jacket of Blaise Pascal, the French writer. And in that jacket was pinned the testimonial conversion of Pascal, where he described it in one word, fire. And here he was, having lived a life sensually driven, deliberately pleasurable, with no boundaries for him, brilliant in his writings. And he's lying in his bed and he says to his lover, Robbie Ross, thinking of all of the exploits and the lives they'd plundered. And he says, Robbie, with any one of those little boys that you loved and I loved, did you love any one of them for their own sakes? Think of that. What a question. Did you love any one of them for their own sake? Robbie Ross says no. He goes on to say, bring me a minister, for only Christ now is big enough to cleanse this heart of mine. You know, ladies and gentlemen, atheism has this tremendous attraction and seduction because it has the appearance of a world without boundaries. It has the scaffolding on which you can plant any kind of structure you want, only to find out it doesn't hold for the most important questions of your life. So in the time that I have tonight, and I'm going to race through some of this, I'm taking the first part of my talk here, and even though I said it tongue-in-cheek earlier, really, a subject like this doesn't do anything for my soul. It really doesn't. I'd sooner sit back at home and put my head on a cushion and get a little sleep. That might do something better for me. But you have to deal with these issues. It's almost the bane of my existence to have to drive a wedge into issues as Ray does and Kirk does and some of the other speakers here. But it has to be done because you have to think your worldview through. And maybe there are some of you here tonight who have flirted with a secularized lifestyle, with a world without boundaries, and thought to yourself, maybe there is a greater attraction to all of this than the world that I actually live by and want to try my best to follow. I want to read for you an extensive passage. It is powerful if you follow every metaphor and see every hint of an idea here. It was written by a man who lived between 1844 and 1900. His name was Friedrich Nietzsche. He was one of the most brilliant German philosophers, a nihilistic philosopher of meaninglessness. He had an influence on Adolf Hitler. Nietzsche's writings were taken by Hitler and presented personally to Stalin and Mussolini. He's the man who coined the phrase, God is dead. He's the one who talked about the supremacy of being the Superman, a man who could pull himself up by his own metaphysical bootstraps. This is Nietzsche. The irony of it is Nietzsche's father was a pastor. Both of his grandfathers were in the ministry. And yet he renounced his faith in God. He believed intellectually it didn't come together. It didn't hold together. And so he wrote this parable. Have you not heard of that madman who lit a lantern in the bright morning hours, who ran to the marketplace and cried incessantly, I'm looking for God. I'm looking for God. As many of those who did not believe in God were standing together there, he excited considerable laughter. Have you lost him, said one. Did he lose his way like a child, said another. Maybe God is hiding. Is he afraid of us? Has he gone on a voyage or emigrated? Thus they shouted and laughed him to scorn. But the madman sprang into their midst and pierced them with his glances. Where is God? He cried. I'll tell you, we have killed him, you and I. We are all his murderers. But how were we able to do this? How were we able to drink up the sea? Who gave us a sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? Notice the metaphors he's using here. How are we able to drink up a whole sea? How are we able to erase the horizon? You see, these are the demarcations of life. And so he's asking this. What did we do when we unchained this earth from its sun? Whither are we moving now? Away from all suns? Do you think we are now perpetually falling backwards and forwards and sidewards in all directions? Is there any up or down left? Are we not straying through an infinite nothing? Do we not feel the breath of empty space? Has it not suddenly become colder? Is not more and more night coming on us all the time? Must not lanterns have to be lit in the morning hours? Do we not hear anything yet of the noise of grave diggers who are burying God? Do we not smell anything yet of God's decomposition? God's decomposed too, you know, and he is now dead. He remains dead. We have killed him. Now, how shall we, the murderer of all murderers, compose ourselves? Because that which was the holiest and mightiest of all that the world ever possessed has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood from us? With what water can we purify ourselves? What festivals of atonement? What sacred games will we need to invent? Is this not too great a deed for us? Must we not now ourselves have to become God, simply to seem worthy of it? There's never been a greater deed than this, you know, and whoever is born after us for the sake of this deed shall be part of a higher history than all history hitherto. Here the madman fell silent, and again regarded his listeners. They too were silent, and they stared at him in astonishment. At last he threw his lantern to the ground, and it broke and it went out. I come too early. My time has not yet come. It has been related further on the same day that the madman entered diverse churches and there sang a requiem, Aeternam Deo. Let out and quieted, he is said to have retorted each time, what are these churches now, if they are not the tombs and sepulchres of a dead God? God is dead, we have killed him. You know, the irony of Nietzsche's life is that the last 14 years of his life he spent in an insane asylum himself. And his mother was a godly woman who'd sit by his bedside, and he would go into weeks and weeks and weeks of silence, and suddenly would burst out with some words. And you know what they would invariably be? Words of scripture which he'd memorized as a younger boy. An irony to what he's saying. Is there any up or down left? Must we not have to light lanterns in the morning hours because we have wiped away the entire horizon and erased any points of measurement? There's a poet who wrote this. First, dentistry was painless, then bicycles were chainless, and carriages were horseless, and many laws enforceless. Next, cookery was fireless, telegraphy was wireless, cigars were nicotineless, and coffee caffeineless. Soon oranges were seedless, the putting green was weedless, the college boy was hatless, the proper diet fatless. New motor roads are dustless, the latest steel is rustless, our tennis courts are sodless, our new religion godless. We have come to a point now of seeing life in a way that we in the West are trying to define without God. You know, I've just got off a plane 3 days ago. I've been gone for about a month, speaking the last week in Hong Kong. And you talk to an average Chinese who has just come out of China, and they will tell you it's the fastest growing church in the world. They tried it the godless way, and it cost them tens of millions of lives in the process because somebody had to play God. And I would speak there day after day, night after night, and see powerful Chinese Christian businessmen and women, brilliant young students. And one night speaking to political leadership at a club, and they would listen and listen and listen. And they are hungry to find out what the Christian faith is all about and how its ramifications work out in culture. While they are pursuing that way, we are trying to find out how to go the godless way out here. It's a strange affliction that has stricken the West, that has lived off the capital and the bequest of the Judeo-Christian worldview. And now we want to stand planting our feet firmly in midair. It's a tragedy. The idea is this: if there is no moral lawgiver who is transcendent to you and me, then there is no moral law by which we must dictate our lives except the moral law that we invent for ourselves. Now, I want you to follow this very carefully, because this is not an argument easily understood. I get it again and again and again, and I got it from a brilliant Fulbright scholar last week in Hong Kong. And they generally will listen to something I've said on tape or written, and then I can predict what the question is going to be. Actually, if you walk into any university campus, if you give me a blank sheet of paper, I'll write out 20 questions and tell you these are the questions for tonight. I haven't heard a new one in a long, long time. Oh, names may change, ideas don't. Malcolm Muggeridge said all new news is old news happening to new people. And so I tell a story of this time I was in the University of Nottingham many, many years ago. It was in the early days of apologetics. Very daunting. And a student shot up out of his seat and he just shouted at me and he said, "There cannot be a God because there's too much evil in this world." I said, "Remain standing. I'd like to interact with you. When you say there's evil, aren't you assuming there's such a thing as good?" He said, "Yes." I said, "When you say there's such a thing as good, aren't you assuming there's such a thing as a moral law on the basis of which to differentiate between good and evil?" He struggled with that for a moment because he knew he was possibly going into some quicksand. But you see, you can't struggle with that for a moment. You have to say, is there a moral law? Bertrand Russell, when he was debating the Jesuit philosopher Frederick Copleston, Copleston said to him in their debate, which is given in Russell's book, Why I'm Not a Christian, Copleston says to him, do you believe in the difference between good and bad? He said, yes. How do you differentiate between it? Bertrand Russell said, the same way I differentiate between blue and green. Copleston said, wait a minute, you differentiate between blue and green by seeing, don't you? He said, yes. How do you differentiate between good and bad? And Russell said, on the basis of feeling. What else? Copleston was a kind man. He really should have said, Mr. Russell, in some cultures they love their neighbors, in other cultures they eat them. Both on the basis of feeling. Do you have any personal preference? And I told that story to this fellow. He said, okay, I guess there has to be a moral law. I said, you say there's too much of evil in this world. When you say there's evil, you assume there's good. When you assume there's good, you assume there's such a thing as a moral law on the basis of which to differentiate between good and evil. He said, I'll grant you that. I said, but if you assume a moral law, you must posit a moral law giver, but that's whom you're trying to disprove and not prove. Because if there's no moral law giver, there's no moral law. If there's no moral law, there's no good. If there's no good, there's no evil. What is your question? I promise you this is exactly what happened. He looked at me. He said, what then am I asking you? I said, I'm not going to help you if you don't know what the question is. But you know, he was caught in the moment of experiential inescapability. Here he was trying to argue too much evil. But in experience, it suddenly came down to the heart, and he thought to himself, why am I asking this? Because if I'm a real naturalist, there's no such thing as evil. We're all dancing to our DNA. That's what Richard Dawkins said. Now, here's the point, and I want you to follow me. Why do we have to have a moral lawgiver? That's the big gap that the questioner cannot seem to cross. They'll say something like, all right, I say there's such a thing as evil, I assume there's good, I assume there's such a thing as a moral law. Why do I have to go to a moral lawgiver? In fact, the guy who questioned me in Hong Kong on this subject put the question in these words. You know, as evolution came about and we developed our pragmatic ways, we came about to barter things, and currency came into being, and economics and so on. Why can't we arrive at morality the same way? Evidently, he hadn't given too much thought to the economics of today. What value is money in itself? Nothing. In fact, you ask an average economist, what is money? They really don't have the answer. And so we go and borrow without the ability to repay, and we print money without a standard, and we are digging ourselves into total economic chaos. Because we don't have an ontic referent for its real value. Morality has no value unless it has something transcending itself that gives itself the value. And every time you raise the question of evil, follow me now. Every time you raise the question of evil, it is either raised by a person or about persons. You don't ask a question like, why does this wood rot? It's terrible that this wood rots. I feel so badly for this wood. No. Why did 10,000 people die? Why the tsunami? It is always raised by a person or about persons. And if the question is of any value, it can only be of value if persons are of value. And the only way a person can have value if there is a transcendent being of infinite worth who has given you that intrinsic worth, not given to you by state or law or by any other fiat will or something else. Which means morality is not an abstraction. It is woven into personhood. The moral law has no value in and of itself unless there is a moral lawgiver of intrinsic worth, by virtue of which all other value pertains. But you know what's happened now? We have no value of any kind. And so the poet writes these words. Who are we? What is our creed? We believe in Marx, Freud, and Darwin. We believe everything is okay as long as you don't hurt anyone, to the best of your definition of hurt, and to the best of your definition of knowledge. We believe in sex before, during, and after marriage. We believe in the therapy of sin. We believe that adultery is fun. We believe that taboos are taboo. We believe that everything's getting better despite evidence to the contrary. The evidence must be investigated, and you can prove anything with evidence. We believe there's something in horoscopes, UFOs, and bent spoons. Jesus was a good man, just like Buddha, Muhammad, and ourselves. He was a good moral teacher, although we think some of his good morals were basically bad. We believe that all religions are basically the same, at least the ones that we read were. They all believe in love and goodness. They only differ on matters of creation, sin, heaven, hell, God, and salvation. We believe that after death comes the nothing, because when you ask the dead what happens, they say nothing. If death is not the end and if the dead have lied, then it's compulsory heaven for all, excepting perhaps Hitler, Stalin, and Genghis Khan. We believe in Masters and Johnson. What's selected is average, what's average is normal, what's normal is good. We believe in total disarmament because we believe there are direct links between warfare and bloodshed. Americans should beat their guns into tractors, and the Russians would be sure to follow. We believe that man is essentially good. It's only his behavior that lets him down. This is the fault of society. Society is the fault of conditions, and conditions are the fault of society. We believe that each man must find the truth that is right for him, and reality will adapt accordingly. The universe will readjust, history will alter. We believe that there is no absolute truth, except the truth that there is no absolute truth. We believe in the rejection of creeds and the flowering of individual thought. And then he puts this postscript: if chance be the father of all flesh, disaster is his rainbow in the sky. And when you hear state of emergency, sniper kills 10, youths go looting, troops on rampage, bomb blast school, it is but the sound of man worshipping his maker. If chance be the father of all flesh, disaster is his rainbow in the sky. And when you hear the sound of emergency, troops go looting, youth bomb blast school, it is but the sound of man worshipping his maker. Ladies and gentlemen, if we don't get this right, we slide into the abyss of total relativism, in which the most powerful and the greediest and the most destructive will triumph in the end. I remember I was in Bangkok, Thailand for some meetings, and the front desk lady called me. They know me there quite well. She says, "Mr. Zacharias, have you turned on your television?" I said, "No." "Why?" She said, "Because your country is being bombed." I said, "What?" She said, "Your country is being bombed." I didn't know what she meant. I turned it on, and what I saw was so surreal. I didn't know if that was actually happening or not. We had a donor in our ministry, a young man, who saw this happening from a distance. And his wife wrote to us a week later saying he was so despondent, he literally thought it was the end of America, the end of the world. He went into our home, took out a gun, and finished himself off. Total despair. Total despair. If God doesn't exist, the God of the Bible, the radicals who did that think they play God. They really don't. It's a political theory masquerading as a religion, with a hot seedbed of hate and destruction, where the only answer is killing. The moral law says this: your life is of intrinsic value, and I cannot violate it. I cannot violate your life. I cannot violate your sexuality. I cannot violate your home. I cannot violate your property. I cannot violate your time. It's all sacred. If you take the 10 Commandments and put one word at the top of it, it'll be the word sacred. Life is sacred, time is sacred, property is sacred. I have no right to violate your life. I must respect it. God pays you the greatest tribute by telling you He's made you in the image of God. When Pilate looked at Jesus, he paid us the greatest tribute by looking at Jesus, putting the words, "Ecce homo," behold the man. Without God, there is no moral law. Without God, there is no meaning. Life has absolutely no meaning. Bertrand Russell said this, that it all ends up in a cloud of despair. There's no essential worth. There's no ultimate purpose. In the 1980s, I was doing an open forum at the University of Philippines in Manila, when a student popped out of his seat and he shouted at me. He said, "Everything is meaningless." I don't know why you're talking about meaning. Everything is meaningless. I said, "You don't believe that." He said, "I do." I said, "No, you don't." He said, "Yes, I do." I said, "You don't." He said, "Who are you to tell me I don't?" I said, "Repeat it." He said, "Everything is meaningless." I said, "You don't mean that." He said, "I do." I said, "Can I ask you a question? If everything is meaningless, then what you just said was not meaningful. On the other hand, if what you just said was meaningful, then everything is not meaningless. In effect, you've really said nothing." You know what happened after that meeting? I was walking out with some of the guys who had brought me in. I generally need some ushers to get me out. So he was taking me out, and I saw this guy standing at the back of the hall saying, "If everything is meaningless and everything." That night he came to the local church where I was doing evangelistic meetings. When I gave the invitation, he was the first one up at the altar on his knees before God, finding meaning for the first time. That's exactly what Oscar Wilde meant. Did you love any one of them for their own sakes? You are loved by God for your own sake. God doesn't want you to be anybody else. He's wired you. He's framed you. He's made you as a distinctive and a unique individual. Honor that investment by the distinctive splendor that He has given to you individually. Don't try to be somebody else. Accept the way He's made you as a unique gift that is distinctively yours. That is distinctively yours. You know, we had all kinds of problems in our home today. The basement got flooded, and one of the drawers in the kitchen broke. And all this was going on, and my wife has gone to Toronto, so I'm taking care of all of that like a nice husband at home. So I sent her a nice email and said, "You picked the perfect day to do this." And so I called a friend of mine. I said, "Could you help me fix this drawer?" So he showed up, and he spent about 40, 50 minutes, made a brace like this, did that. And I stood there and thought to myself, I'm an absolute fool when it comes to these things. My father-in-law looked at the toolbox in my home once and said, "Is this a toy box or a toolbox?" You should see my hammer. I could put it in my pocket. I have absolutely no ability with those things. The Bible talks about, "In the day shall come when the carpenter shall encourage the goldsmith." Right? A goldsmith works with fine, precious jewelry with an eye for the precious. A carpenter with the rough-hewn stuff, and the man with the rough hands can encourage the man working with the fine, precious jewelry. I don't know how He's made you, but He's given your life meaning. You know, I travel all over the globe. Pastor Johnny and I were talking today and to one of the young people at dinner. In my life, I've traveled through over 60 countries in the last 30-some years. When I started, I had black hair, then I got white hair. Now I'm praying for just hair, if I could have it. And I just think of all of the hours of fatigue and all of this that actually goes on. And then I come back home and get off the plane, and I come back into the house and want to get on my knees and kiss the kitchen floor because I'm home. And one of my kids will run up and just hug and say, "Hi, Dad." It's worth traveling on those long hauls just to come back and have that, or your wife's arm around you and say, "Love you. So glad you're back." If our human value means so much to us, think of what the divine accolade is going to mean when you hear the words, well done. Well done, thou good and faithful servant. That's why Augustine said, you have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in thee. God's made you for a purpose. All the tiny little purposes become purposeful because your life itself has purpose. If you don't have ultimate purpose, all these tiny little purposes are nothing else but ways of tranquilizing your boredom. God's given you a unique calling. Meaning. God's given that to you. But the third thing, He doesn't just promise you a moral framework, doesn't just promise you meaning. For the atheist, it is not there. The atheist has no hope. There's no hope beyond the grave. When life comes to an end, it's gone. It's finished like a vapor. I've just finished my latest book, and it's called Has Christianity Failed You? And I talked to people with all kinds of questions about why they walked away from God. And one of the stories, I met a woman in India whose story I'd known and sat and chatted on it. It's a true story. Lovely young gal, fell in love with a young Indian man and wanted to marry him. But the parents told her that he came from a lower caste, not to please go down the rung of the ladder. She pled with them because she said she loved him. Parents would not give the blessing, so they both eloped. It's very interesting. She was willing to violate the inextricable law of caste, which is intricately woven into the law of karma. Just remember that line. The law of caste, which is inextricably woven into the law of karma. Because of a certain karmic previous life, you're born in the new caste. This is the doctrine that is espoused by tens of millions. So the parents said, no, he's of a different caste. They both eloped, got married. She was posted into another city and went to work there. Days went into weeks, weeks went into months. They were making a living. Met up with another man, quote, attracted to him, stopped corresponding with her husband, communicating with him. He began to suspect something was going on. He said, please give up the job and come back. We can't live like this apart the whole time. She said, no, this is a good job. I've got a good career. So he took a train and went over, fearing some things. Found out it was true. She'd been betraying her trust and told him that she'd met somebody else and wanted to marry him. He said, look, when you and I got married, my parents disowned me. Your parents disowned you. We had nobody left in this world except each other. And now you're walking out on me. Please don't do that. He pleaded and begged. Young woman across the table there talking. It would have nothing to do with it. Finally, he said to her, if you don't want me, I'm going to have to go back. Of course, I can't force you. He went away for some few minutes, came back. He said, please do me a favor. I really do love you. I'd ask you to just lie down next to me for a few minutes so I could hold you close and then leave, but you won't let me. Let me just put my head on your lap for 30 minutes and close my eyes and enjoy my nearness to you for just 30 minutes. Would you let me do that? Just let me put my head on your lap. He did. She did. Unknown to her, he had taken a very deadly poison when he had stepped out and died on her lap. Years have gone by. The memory was haunting her, terrified. I said, what was the answer to this? She couldn't get away from the trauma of it, so she went to see a Hindu priest. And he took her astrological chart and his astrological chart and the date they were married and so on, and said to her, I have the answer for you. In your previous life, when you were a little girl, he raped you. And this was now his karma of what happened at your hands. So you don't need to feel guilty about this at all. It was the karma that he had earned from his past rapacious act in the previous life. A brilliant, successful businesswoman across the table who eased her conscience on this by believing that in the previous life she'd been raped by this man and therefore he was getting his due rewards. You know, the human heart longs for some freedom. Freedom from guilt, freedom from wrong, and freedom ultimately from the chains of death. I'll give you this little story and close with my final thought. You know, my father-in-law, my wife's visiting her mother in Toronto, and I'll be joining her next in just 2 or 3 days. I'm holding some meetings there, so we'll be together. But 4 years ago, she lost her father very suddenly. He was 85. From diagnosis to death in cancer, it was 4 months. Robust, healthy, fine man. I don't know if I've known a better man closely in my life than him. The perfect gentleman. Never saw him get into a car first without letting his wife in first. Never saw him sit down before he pulled the chair to let his wife sit down or his daughter sit down. He was the quintessential gentleman. I mean it. And when we lost him, and lost in my father-in-law, a man I so revered, my children just treasured him. But he shriveled down in the last 4 months as the cancer began to eat away at him, and he was so distraught because he never wanted to be seen with such indignity. He came down to a bag of bones, and then for a long time even couldn't speak. I went and spent some time with him and told him how much his life had meant, what a light it had been to so many. He was a World War II veteran, great engineer, worked for Shell Oil all of his career, 30-some years. Churchman, devout elder, godly man, daily with his Bible and his hymn book. And then lost his ability to speak. And his daughters were gathered around his bed before I was on my way flying. I was somewhere literally in midair. Spoke to him on the phone saying, "Dad, I'm coming." And as the last breaths were entering his body, he managed to get just enough strength to say these 2 things. I've quoted him in my book, The Grand Weaver. He looked at his wife of 65 years and he mouthed the words, "Jean, I love you." And then he lifted his eyes to the heavens and he said this, "Amazing, just amazing." And he was gone. The hope in atheism is not there. It's oblivion, nothingness. Straying through an infinite nothing, no up or down, lanterns in the nighttime hours, the noise of grave diggers. Without God, there's no moral framework. There's no meaning, no ultimate meaning, no hope. And lastly, there's no recovery. If you rejected him and you turn out to be wrong, that was a huge gamble you took in life. If you believed in him and you were wrong, nothing doesn't want to be something. That's what Pascal said in his wager. He said, "Look, boys, if I've been wrong, what is your test for meaning? Happiness." And he said, "I've been happy. And so if I die, I die." But he said, if you boys are wrong in rejecting him, you got a king-size headache coming at the end of it, for having rejected the one who made you and framed you. I want to close with 2 things that I think will mean very much to you. The first one is this. In 1971, when I was in my mid-20s and did my first overseas trip, still an undergraduate student, and preached in Vietnam, I remember going to speak to the American troops. They're the ones who took me around in their gunships, in their transport planes, and took me from city to city. God did a marvelous thing, and thousands came to Christ. My interpreter was only 17 years old. I was 25 with a cumulative age of 42. God brought revival in Vietnam. And one of those soldiers who was seriously injured there wrote this, "Lord God, I have never spoken to you, but now I want to say, how do you do? You see, God, they told me you didn't exist, and like a fool I believed all this. Last night from a shell hole I saw your sky. I figured right then they had told me a lie. Had I taken time to see the things you made, I'd have known they weren't calling a spade a spade. I wonder, God, if you'll take my hand Somehow I feel that you'll understand. Funny I had to come to this hellish place before I had time to see your face. Well, I guess there isn't much more to say, but I'm sure glad God I met you today. I guess 0 hour will soon be here, but I'm not afraid since I know you're near. The signal, well, God, I'll have to go. I like you lots, I want you to know. Look now, this will be a horrible fight. Who knows, I may come to your house tonight. Though I wasn't friendly to you before, I wonder, God, if you'd wait at your door. Look, I'm crying, I'm shedding tears. I'll have to go now, God, goodbye. Strange now since I met you, I'm not afraid to die. On Fox News today, they interviewed a young woman by the name of Janelle Guzman. She was the last one to be rescued when the towers fell. She'd been there for so many hours, and her story was written called A Hand in the Rubble. That hand was sticking out when the firefighters and others heard the sounds of life and dug out the rubble and rescued her. If you go to preach at the Brooklyn Tabernacle or attend Brooklyn Tabernacle today, Janelle Guzman sits in the front row of the choir. And today she told them, I just kept praying and praying and praying. God answered my prayer. I'm one of those fortunate ones to still be around after that horrible incident. You know, when God gives you a purpose and hope, He reminds you that there's a time for you to live and a time for you to be called home, and He'll preserve you till then. And in a strange way, I want to close with this rather strange thing. It's quite funny, actually, and I have a reason for this. Because, you know, some years ago, the Russian chess master Garry Kasparov was challenged by computer programmers and systems engineers, saying they could design a computer that would beat him. And he took that personally. He was not used to losing like that. So they designed a computer and he beat it. Finally, the best minds in the world for IBM got together and they designed one called Deep Blue. And Garry Kasparov went into hiding because he was afraid that if he did lose, he would lose it, he said, for human dignity. I lost my dignity after the calculators came out. And he's talking about this. So they designed Deep Blue. Professor David Galertner, at that time professor of computer science at Yale University, in Time magazine wrote this about the challenge between Kasparov and Deep Blue. He said, the idea that Deep Blue has a mind is absurd. How can an object that wants nothing, fears nothing, enjoys nothing, needs nothing, and cares about nothing have a mind? It can win at chess, but not because it wants to. No, it isn't happy when it wins or sad when it loses. What are its after-the-match plans if it beats Kasparov? Is it hoping to take Deep Pink out for a night on the town? No, it doesn't care about chess or anything else. It plays the game for the same reason a calculator adds or a toaster toasts, because it is a machine designed for that purpose. No matter what feats they perform inside, there will always be a big fat zero. No computer can achieve artificial thought without achieving artificial emotion too. In the long run, I doubt if there is any kind of human behavior computers cannot fake, any kind of performance they cannot put on. It is conceivable that one day computers will be better than human beings at nearly everything. I can imagine that a person might someday have a computer for a best friend. Oh, but that'll be sad. Like having a dog for your best friend, only sadder. The gap between the human and the surrogate is permanent and will never be closed. Machines will continue to make life easier, healthier, richer, and more puzzling, and human beings will continue to care, ultimately about the same things they always have about one another, and many of them about God. You see, he couldn't resist the fact that the difference between a machine and a human being is God. You're not a machine. You're a creature created in the image of God. And when you deny God, there's no moral law, there's no meaning, there's no hope, and if you're wrong, there's no recovery. have no doubt that there is an easier way to make a living than to be doing this. But we are here for some more important reasons than just ease or comfort. We're here because we believe truth matters, and that truth can be discussed not only intelligently, but cordially. Even if we were to have our disagreements, we don't have to be disagreeable. And I say that very sincerely, because you may be well aware of what a difficult task it is for somebody like myself to be moving around the world from campus to campus or in various settings where people hold their beliefs or their convictions very deeply. Just a couple of weeks ago, I was in the country of my birth, and it was in one of India's cities delivering lectures on philosophy and truth and God and the problem of evil, where the majority of the audience would have held a completely different worldview to mine. And yet the marvelous thing is that we can discuss these issues and try to come to some common grounds of agreement, and where there is disagreement, learn to live and let live. I think the key of what Mike Sorge just said is very important. Neither I nor anyone else that works in these forums has any intention of imposition of an idea, either here or socially or otherwise. We are purely here to allow our minds to wrestle with issues that we do so privately anyway, and hopefully do so interactively here and meaningfully, hoping that if indeed we discover error in our thinking, we would take that into consideration and reconsider what it is we have committed our lives and our destinies to. I was thinking of that story that I'm sure some of you have heard in various forms. Stories of this nature may have their way of making the rounds, and generally the more humorous they are, the more commonly they are known, but I'll nevertheless run the risk, because there's always the possibility at least one person hasn't heard it, and we'd like to start on common ground anyway. So it's the story of this renowned physicist who was going from place to place delivering speeches on some very, very obscure subjects that only a handful of people could understand, but he was renowned in his field and delivering all these talks from venue to venue, and all of a sudden took ill. And he said to his chauffeur, "I do not know how I'm going to deliver this talk. I'm not feeling well at all." And the chauffeur said, "Sir, to be very honest with you, I've heard you deliver this so many times that I can just about give it verbatim just as well as you do. So if you have no problem with it, I'll be glad to trade my uniform with you and wear your suit, and I'll stand up there and give the talk." The professor, rather intimidated by this threat of his, said, "All right, let's see how you do." They made the trade, and the professor in the chauffeur's uniform sat in the back row, and the chauffeur in the professorial outfit decided to deliver the speech, and did so flawlessly. Not even one error in the whole talk. At the end of the talk came the Q&A time, and somebody raised a question of him, to which he promptly said, "You know, that is such a mindless question. It has such little intellectual value that even my chauffeur sitting in the back row could answer that." Sometimes I wish I could travel with a chauffeur like that. I will do my best after I present my talk to deal with your questions as best as I can, and hopefully we can keep it within the context of the subject matter that I'm wrestling with here. For those of you who are aware of what the other two Veritas Forums have done in the last 2 years, the first one, the focus was on science. Last year was on science and philosophy. And this year we are going to deal with the existential struggles, the issues that you and I confront in our day-to-day existence, the questions, the issues where all of your thinking comes into contact with the jagged edges of reality, those existential struggles which haunt us and do not escape any one of us. So that will be the focus as I deal with these talks 2 nights. Tonight I want to deal with the question, can man live without God? And please pardon me, I mean that sincerely for the title, so that it does not convey any gender insensitivity. It was borrowed right out of a quote from Will Durant when he said the greatest question of our time is not East versus West or North versus South, or Europe versus America, or capitalism versus Marxism. The greatest question of our time is if man can live without God. The idea whether humanity can bring together for its own cultural existence a coherent interpretation of life in the passages of our lives individually and as we learn to live across many cultures. And so, as we wrestle with these existential issues, tonight I want to answer that question and the shortcomings and the struggles that atheism as a philosophy faces. We need to recognize this, and I will point out at least 4 great struggles that the atheistic worldview has to wrestle with, and sometimes the logical outworking. It is not the natural outworking for everybody who claims to be an atheist, but the philosophy lends itself to some of the conclusions that I will bring to you this evening. Then tomorrow evening, answer the difficult question, if you are holding forth for the defense of Christian theism, can really a claim be made to the exclusivity of one way? And what about all the other systems of thought and belief? Can really the Christian faith make such a claim? And the title that has been assigned is, Who is Jesus? Does it really matter? And that'll be my challenge tomorrow evening. I hope you'll be able to join us for that one as well. I am convinced that philosophy comes at 3 levels. It comes level 1 from a theoretical vantage point. That's where you will study it in your discipline in academia, whether you go through it very intensively or whether you go through it more as introductory courses. In that, the focus is to try to understand the history of thinkers and the history of thought and how they have brought their thinking to bear in an attempt to explain either all of reality or some vital part of their own and our own existence. You study that formally. It is a discipline that challenges us to understand the rigors of the thinking as it was given to us by great and notable thinkers. That is level 1. It provides a theoretical substructure. But over and above that, philosophy also comes into our lives at a 2nd level. That's where the role of the arts and the media, I think, and drama play a vitally important part. Most dramatists or novelists or musicians may not think of themselves as philosophers of culture, but the fact of the matter is they are either communicating or having an impact philosophically upon large numbers of people. They may not pause to question the rigors of what they're saying or the cogency of what they're saying or the logical consistency of what they're saying, but even though they may speak evocatively, they are certainly communicating that which they sense to be real. And it is one of the most powerful medium of philosophical communication today. I think we minimize the effect of such thinking if we ignore the fact that the arts are indeed a level of philosophical communication. Then the 3rd level comes in the ideas that you may discuss around the kitchen table at home, either with a friend or with a family member or with one of your youngsters, where issues of morality are raised at the table, and somebody might say, all right, Dad, today we were in the classroom discussing such and such a moral issue, and I did not know how to answer that question. Now, you've told me that we hold this position in our family, and you've told me that because you say that's what the Bible says. But Dad, if I go into the classroom and tell the people I believe such and such of a mode of behavior to be right because that's what the Bible says, I'm going to be laughed out of there because to most of the people sitting around that room, it's not going to be considered a recognized authority. And the youngster is raising a very legitimate question of his father and saying, give me something more solid. But the fact of the matter is, it is a dialogue of philosophical proportions. And to be consistent, to give meaningful answers interactively, I have proposed that when we come to a certain conclusion, it should be argued from level 1. where there is theoretical or logical coherence given to the argument. It may be illustrated from level 2, from the arts, but then it is applied at level 3 in your day-to-day living or in the kitchen table conversation. You argue from the first level, you illustrate it from the second level, and then apply it from the third level. And that is the method of argumentation that I will interweave as we go through the existential struggles, so that tomorrow particularly, as I even set the parameters for the laws of logic and how they apply to reality, you'll begin to see that these are not just statements based on emotion or feeling, but hopefully there is also logical consistency, empirical adequacy, and then it comes to existential relevance. You build it on level 1, illustrate it from level 2, and apply it at level 3. So that's what I propose to do. Let me start off in a simple way then, since it is the existential struggle, with a second level illustration where I began my own struggle and my own journey into such thinking. Please bear with me, because it'll communicate to you how even as a teenager, India is a land of philosophers, and we think about these things, even if not in a serious level, at a popular level. And I recall when I was in my teens sitting in my living room in New Delhi, India, listening to a radio station, which was the one station I could get on Western music, listening to it in the evening. And as I began to listen to that song being narrated, it drew my attention for two reasons. First, the background music sounded like an Eastern chant, almost like a prayer being enunciated. But even more than that, the questions that were being raised. Andrew Fletcher, the 18th century Scottish political activist, put it this way: "Let me write the songs of a nation. I don't care who writes its laws." And there's that second level philosophy foreseen even a century and a half ago. But here it is, the words that began to just make their inroads into my own thinking. It was narrated by Ed Ames. From the canyons of the mind, we wander on and stumble blind, wade through the often tangled maze of starless nights and sunless days, hoping for some kind of clue, a road to lead us to the truth. But who will answer? Side by side, two people stand, together vowing hand in hand that love's embedded in their hearts, but soon an empty feeling starts to overwhelm their hollow lives. And if they ask the hows and whys, who will answer? Far upon a distant hill, a young man's lying very still. His arms will never hold his child, because a bullet running wild has struck him down, and now he cries, "My God, oh why, oh why?" And who will answer? As high upon a lonely ledge, a figure teeters near the edge, while jeering crowds collect below to egg him on with "Go, man, go." But none will ask what led him to his private day of doom, and who will answer? As 'neath the spreading mushroom tree, the world revolves with apathy, while overhead a row of specks roars on, drowned out by discotheques. And if the secret button's pressed because one man has been outguessed, who will answer? Is our hope in walnut shells, worn round the neck with temple bells, or deep within some cloistered walls, where hooded figures pray in shawls, or high upon some dusty shelves, or in the stars, or in ourselves? Who will answer? And the chorus went this way: if the soul is darkened by a fear it cannot name, if the mind is baffled when the rules don't fit the game, who will answer? Who will answer? Who will answer? And the surprising aspect of that narrative to me was, you'll have to pardon my ignorance at that point, but I was quite taken aback that somebody living in a country so wealthy, living particularly in that part of the country which epitomized all that young people pined for, Hollywood itself, was raising exactly the same questions I was. Evidently, all the wealth and all the success and all the material comfort and all the attainment of aspirations had not in one way steadied that heart or silenced this irrepressible existential cry. Who's going to give the answer to issues like this? Whether it's a young man wanting to take his life, a broken love, or a dream of a marriage, or the death of a little child from your arms, the question is somebody going to give me an answer that will satisfy me? And so the questions then are not only trans-temporal, they have been raised for centuries. They are trans-cultural. They are raised across every culture you go to. And in the 25 years that I have crisscrossed around the globe, after all of the academic struggles of origin and all are raised, the questions of meaning begin to hold pretty firmly in a dialogue. And that, I trust, will be addressed as we wrestle with atheism's struggle. Let me at least define for you the terms here before I begin to unpack some of the existential difficulties. Now, I'm sorry that you will not obviously be able to read it at the back, but some of you in the front may be able to, and certainly I will read it out for your understanding so that you can hear the words here. It is this: two definitions, one from Etienne Bourne in Atheism, and the other from the Encyclopedia of Philosophy, edited by Paul Edwards. Atheism, according to Etienne Bourne, is the deliberate, definite, dogmatic denial of the existence of God. It is not satisfied with approximate truth or relative truth, but claims to see the ins and outs of the game quite clearly, being the absolute denial of the absolute. So it is the deliberate, definite, dogmatic denial of the existence of God, and denies absolutely the existence of the absolute. Paul Edwards, in the Encyclopedia of Philosophy, the first volume, page 175, says this: an atheist is a person who maintains that there is no God. That is, that the sentence God exists expresses a false proposition. In short, it is a person who rejects belief in God. The more popular figure of Madeleine Murray O'Hair gives it in these words: we need a decent, modern, sophisticated, and workable set of standards by which we can get along with ourselves and with others. We atheists try to find some basis of rational thinking on which we can base our actions and our beliefs, and we have it. We accept the technical philosophy of materialism. It is valid philosophy which cannot be discredited. Essentially, materialism's philosophy holds that nothing exists but natural phenomena. Materialism is a philosophy of life and living according to rational processes with intellectual and other capabilities of the individual, to be developed to the highest degree in a social system where this may be possible. There are no supernatural forces, no supernatural entities such as gods or heavens or hells or life after death. There are no supernatural forces, nor can there be. We atheists believe that nature simply exists, matter is. Those are very firm disavowals of the position of theism. This is not merely taking the agnostic position of not knowing, or at this point not being aware of any evidence that constrains the agnostic to believe in a theistic worldview. This is denying both the reality of the absolute, and in Madeleine Murray O'Hair's case, does not even allow for the possibility that anything supernatural could actually exist. Matter is, material is, and that's all it is. Human reason, by our own metaphysical bootstraps and our technological capabilities, we will rise to progress. In 1844, possibly one of the most vociferous atheists addressed this. This was the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche's father was a pastor, and both of his grandfathers were in Christian ministry. So it was quite staggering that a young man like him chose to disbelieve in God. One of the things I do respect about Nietzsche, apart from his genius and his great ability to put thoughts in such poignant form, was the fact that I think Nietzsche was also very honest with the logical outworkings of what it is he believed, possibly more so than many other philosophers. And Nietzsche said this in one of his parables, The Madman. Have you not heard of that madman who lit a lantern in the bright morning hours, ran to the marketplace and cried incessantly, I'm looking for God, I'm looking for God. As many of those who did not believe in God were standing together there, he excited considerable laughter. Have you lost him then, said one. Did he lose his way like a child, said another, or is he hiding?
Is he afraid of us? Has he gone on a voyage or emigrated? Thus they shouted and laughed. But the madman sprang into their midst and pierced them with his glances. Where is God? He cried. I shall tell you. We have killed him, you and I. We are all his murderers. But how have we done this? How were we able to drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? What did we do when we unchained this earth from its sun? Whither is it moving now? Whither are we moving now? Away from all suns? Are we not perpetually falling backwards, forwards, sidewards, in all directions? Is there any up or down left? Are we not straying through an infinite nothing? Do we not feel the breath of empty space? Has it not suddenly become colder? Is not more and more night coming on us all the time? Must not lanterns now be lit in the morning? Do we not hear anything yet of the noise of the grave diggers who are burying God? Do we not smell anything yet of God's decomposition? Gods do decompose, and God is dead. He remains dead, and we have killed him. Now, how shall we, the murderer of all murderers, compose ourselves? Because that which was holiest and mightiest of all that the world has yet possessed has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood from us? With what water could we purify ourselves? What festivals of atonement? What sacred games shall we need to invent? Is not this the greatest of deeds, too great for us? Must not we ourselves now become God, simply to seem worthy of it? There has never been a greater deed, and whoever shall be born after us for the sake of this deed shall be part of a higher history than all history hitherto. Then he goes on to close it with these words. It has been related further that on that same day the madman entered diverse churches, and there sang a requiem, Aeternam Deo. Led out and quieted, he is said to have retorted each time, what are these churches now, if they are not the tombs and sepulchres of a dead God? God is dead, and we have killed him. The poignancy, the imagery, but at the same time the great legitimacy of his questions. What sacred games will we need to invent? Is there any up or down? Is it all not suddenly becoming colder? I recall the words of G.K. Chesterton, the journalist and the philosopher. He said this, God is like the sun. You cannot look at it, but without it you can't look at anything else. And that is the point basically Nietzsche is raising in a different form. How do we now interpret all of existence? Because suddenly we have redefined everything. And the logical outworking of this has been sensed by many, many thinkers at every level. Listen, for example, to the tongue-in-cheek response of the journalist from England, Steve Turner, who has got a book of this kind of poetry that he puts on. He's a satirist. He deals with satire and analyzes all of our idiosyncrasies in our cultures. Here's what he calls the creed. We believe now in Marx, Freud, and Darwin. We believe everything is okay as long as you don't hurt anyone to the best of your definition of hurt and to the best of your definition of knowledge. We believe in sex before, during, and after marriage. We believe in the therapy of sin. We believe that adultery is fun. We believe that taboos are taboo. We believe that everything is getting better, despite evidence to the contrary. The evidence must be investigated, and you can prove anything with evidence. We believe that there's something in horoscopes, UFOs, and bent spoons. Jesus was a good man, just like Buddha, Muhammad, and ourselves. He was a good moral teacher, although we think his good morals were basically bad. We believe that all religions are basically the same. At least the ones that we read were. They all believe in love and goodness. They only differ in matters of creation, sin, heaven, hell, God, and salvation. We believe that after death comes the nothing, because when you ask the dead what happens, they say nothing. If death is not the end, and if the dead have lied, then it's compulsory heaven for all, except perhaps Hitler, Stalin, and Genghis Khan. We believe in Masters and Johnson. What's selected is average, what's average is normal, what's normal is good. We believe in total disarmament. We believe there are direct links between warfare and bloodshed. Americans should beat their guns into tractors and the Russians would be sure to follow. We believe that man is essentially good. It is only his behavior that lets him down. This is the fault of society. Society is the fault of conditions, and conditions are the fault of society. We believe that each man must find the truth that is right for him, and reality will adapt accordingly. The universe will readjust, history will alter. We believe that there is no absolute truth except the truth that there is no absolute truth. We believe in the resurrection of creeds and the flowering of individual thought. And then he adds this postscript: if chance be the father of all flesh, disaster is his rainbow in the sky. And when you hear state of emergency, sniper kills 10, troops on rampage, youths go looting, bomb blast school, it is but the sound of man worshipping his maker. If chance be the father of all flesh, disaster is his rainbow in the sky. And when you hear state of emergency, sniper kills 10, troops on rampage, youths go looting, bomb blast school, it is but the sound of man worshipping his maker. Suddenly, that tongue-in-cheek humor had a cutting edge at the end of it, and there's a fear that there's a lot of reality in that postscript of his. Was it not Malcolm Muggeridge who said, if God is dead, somebody is going to have to take his place? It is going to be either megalomania or erotomania, the drive for power or the drive for pleasure, the clenched fist or the phallus, Hitler or Hugh Hefner. All of us have moments in our lives when suddenly your worldview is jolted and you come into contact with an experience or an occasion that changes you unalterably. Even though it was my privilege in the 70s to be in Vietnam and Cambodia, speaking to the troops and speaking primarily amongst the Vietnamese troops and then the American troops there too, and noticing all that war had done to ravage these countries and ravage so many men and women. As much as I had experienced all of those while I was still in my 20s, that molded and shaped a lot of my own thinking, to take my own belief either more seriously or to analyze its points of vulnerability. I was not prepared for what happened to me in the 1980s when I was invited to do a series of lectures in Poland. This was before the Cold War had really begun to thaw. How that invitation came about is in itself a long story. But I was invited to speak at the large ice arena in the heart of Warsaw, where a large crowd of people were attending night after night, and it was my privilege to deliver some message talks that they'd asked me to talk on, particularly the possibility of God's existence in a country that where the Marxist ideology had tried to eradicate it from the minds of men and women. And at the end of those lectures is when the experience came about. My host said to me, "Have you ever visited one of the death camps from the Third Reich?" I said, "No." I'd had the privilege some years before of being in East Berlin and seeing Buchenwald, but that was not a death camp. And he said, "Would you like to see this?" Expecting to see nothing more than just some kind of a museum, I went. And I will never forget that cold, blustery, wintry day. As bleak as it was on the outside, it was only bleaker on the inside. I won't go into the details to tell you all of the horrors of the sights that I saw. But if you have seen even brief footage from it anywhere at any time, you know how revolting it was. Possibly the darkest moment comes when you walk into the room and see the pictures on the walls of the little boys with whom Joseph Mengele had done his experimentation. And to see those thousands of little suitcases and little clothes of boys and girls, the thousands of tiny pairs of shoes and the toothbrushes, and you just walk from room to room swallowing back the emotion. I recall then getting to one of the rooms where the men and women were sent to their death, some who never made it into the final stage in the gas chambers, and seeing a statement there by Adolf Hitler that had these words, that he was determined to raise a generation of young people devoid of a conscience, imperious, relentless, and cruel. I remember as I walked away from there wishing there were somebody with whom I could discuss how I was feeling, only to see the teenagers outside those rooms, tears running down their face. And I began to recollect, as I had read in the life of Nietzsche and done all of the reading about the Third Reich and so on, the impact that Nietzsche's philosophy had had on Adolf Hitler. And Hitler, of course, had distributed Nietzsche's writings to Mussolini and to Stalin, whom historians brand the three devils of the 20th century. And I began to recognize how a philosophy, please get me clearly here now, I am not saying that every atheist is compelled to move in this direction. Absolutely not. There are many morally minded atheists, and we will get to the options they do give to us in cultural humanism, in pragmatic humanism, even in existential humanism. And you have Ayn Rand's egocentric humanism. You can find a lot of positive insights of those who are living in a closed system with God locked out of it. But the fact of the matter is, when you do lock God out of it, it opens up the terrain for a logical outworking of inventing your own ethic and living by it and justifying it by whatever pragmatism you can bring into it. And the fact of the matter is, you see this again and again. When, for example, at the judgments were taking place at Nuremberg, when somebody was asked about why he had consented to such horrendous, heinous evil, and his answer was that he was operating according to the law of the land, the very answers that Eichmann gave at his trial in the early 60s, although it's more than 2 decades later. People were sort of questioning, but is there not a law that transcends the law of the land? Is there not something within you that rises beyond that? Was there not a counterintuitive point within you to say that what it is you're doing was damnable and hellish and the exploitation of human beings? But listen to the words of Eichmann as he walked to the gallows, as Hannah Arendt gave it to us in her book, In the Trial of Adolf Eichmann. Listen to how she gives the last 2 paragraphs. Adolf Eichmann went to the gallows with great dignity. He had asked for a bottle of red wine and had drunk half of it. He refused the help of the Protestant minister, the Reverend William Hull, who offered to read the Bible with him. He had only 2 more hours to live, and therefore no time to waste. He walked the 50 yards from his cell to the execution chamber, calm and direct, with his hands bound behind him. When the guards tied his ankles and knees, he asked them to loosen the bonds so that he could stand straight. I don't need that, he said when the black hood was offered to him. He was in complete command of himself. Nay, he was more. He was completely himself. Nothing could have demonstrated this more convincingly than the grotesque silliness of his last words. He began by stating emphatically that he was a Gottgläubiger, to express in common Nazi fashion that he was no Christian and did not believe in life after death. He then proceeded after a short while, gentlemen, we shall all meet again. Such is the fate of all men. Long live Germany, long live Argentina, long live Austria. I shall not forget them. In the face of death, he had found the cliché used in his funeral oratory. Under the gallows, his memory played him the last trick. He was elated, and he forgot that this was his own funeral. It was as though in those last minutes he was summing up the lesson that this long course in human wickedness had taught us, the lesson of the fearsome, word and thought-defying banality of evil, the trivializing of evil. Word and thought-defying. I remember with some of my colleagues who are here going into Yad Vashem in Jerusalem and seeing teenagers going through the thousands of hours of taping and the manuscripts of the Eichmann trial. Imagine young people trying to process all of this in their minds. And ladies and gentlemen, the only reason I bring this is because it stands at the middle of this, the 20th century. And now as we close this century, it has been the bloodiest century in history. And Nietzsche warned us of this. He said a universal madness would break out, and we would, all kinds of bloodletting would take place. Ironically, it was not just Nietzsche who warned us of this. Charles Darwin himself. I remember during my days at Cambridge going through all of the scribbling and the writing that Darwin had done there as he was working through his theory. And the great fear was that if the atheistic philosophy were attached to what he was propounding in scientific terms, he said there'll be all kind of bloodletting that will take place in this logical outworking. And in a pre-Darwinian form, it was Alfred Lord Tennyson who coined that nature red in tooth and claw. So that the logical outworking of a world without God has sort of been lived out in this 20th century. And what was seen in the Holocaust was only, I think, a small representation of someone who could take the logic of playing God and then gave it on to Mussolini and gave it on to Stalin. Stalin, once upon a time a seminary student, who then became an atheist and killed 15 million of his own people. The last thing Stalin did, Malcolm Muggeridge personally conveyed this to me, and I notice historian Paul Johnson has confirmed it in documentation, that Svetlana Stalin, when she was doing a video BBC production with Malcolm Muggeridge, 3 times, says Malcolm Muggeridge, in those few days that she was with him, Muggeridge says, Mr. Zacharias, in 3 days in those few days, 3 times in those few days she was with me, she said this to me. She said, do you know, Mr. Muggeridge, the last thing my father did, as he was hallucinating and lying in bed thinking there were wolves attacking him, but he seemed to regain his composure just once more. And this one-time seminary student turned atheist with such murderous efforts amongst his own people, found just enough strength, said Svetlana Stalin, to sit up in bed one more time, clench his fist towards the heavens, threw his head back in the pillow, and he was gone. One more gesture towards the heavens is what Joseph Stalin wanted. And it is fascinating to try and discuss this now when I had the privilege of speaking at the Lenin Military Academy and have the students raise the issue of what happens when a mind gets so focused on itself and loses the concept of anything transcendent. You may say all this seems like it's way out there and far out in the distance. Listen to the words of Arthur Schlesinger as he delivered in 1989 the induction speech for the new president at Brown University. Listen to what he says. The mystic prophets of the Absolute cannot save us. Sustained by our history and traditions, we must save ourselves at whatever risk of heresy or blasphemy. We can find solace in the memorable representation of the human struggle against the absolute in the finest scene in the greatest of American novels. I refer, of course, to the scene when Huckleberry Finn decides that the plain hand of Providence requires him to tell Miss Watson where her runaway slave Jim is to be found. Huck writes his letter of betrayal to Miss Watson and feels, quote, all washed and clean for the sin for the first time I had ever felt so in my life, and I knowed I could pray now, end of quote. He sits there for a while thinking, quote, how good it was all this happened so, and how near I come to being lost and going to hell. Then Huck begins to think about Jim and the rush of the great river and the talking and the singing and the laughing and the friendship. Then I happened to look around and see that paper, and I took it up and I held it in my hand. I was a-trembling because I'd had to decide forever betwixt 2 things, and I knowed it, and I studied it a minute, sort of holding my breath, and then says to myself, all right then, I'll go to hell, and tore it up. And then Schlesinger adds this, that, if I may say so, is what America is all about. Fascinating that such drastic statements can be made. One has to think of the ramifications, and I won't go into them in our very own culture, except to say to you, my friend, that when life begins to become so independent of a transcendent moral order, you open the floodgates of any kind of idea or justification. I was most intrigued some years ago when I visited Mahatma Gandhi's home in Gujarat, in the city of Ahmedabad. As you enter his home, there is a huge placard out there with these words from Bertrand Russell, who, as we know, was avowedly anti-theistic. And Bertrand Russell had these comments to make about Gandhi's methodology in trying to get India her independence from the British. He said it is doubtful, this is what Russell says there, it is doubtful whether a method so innocuous and so tame at the hands of a man like Gandhi would have succeeded except he was appealing to the conscience of a Christianized nation. Interesting that an anti-theistic thinker referring to the success of a devoutly Hindu man, that his method worked in touching the conscience of the English people, Russell gave one line of strength to the fact that he was appealing to a people whose conscience had something more than just this world in all of its utopianism, that there was a transcendent moral order that ultimately had the triumph. And so as you see the way atheism can work itself out, you end up with a struggle for a moral law. There's no way to find an absolute moral law instead. How would that be if we lived that way in our technology? Which of us would want to get into an aircraft where the pilot says we are about to descend and there's dense fog and my instruments are telling me we are 10,000 feet above, but I have this urge that my instruments are wrong. And so I have this feeling that I'll be happier if I actually think we're only 1,000 feet and lower my landing gear now and just come in with a bang immediately. How many of us would want that? Any time have you been in a car where you're at a traffic light and all of a sudden you see another car moving and you step on your brake because you think you're moving, and the reason was because the other car was moving. So immediately you look at some fixed point like a tree or a building and realize you're not the one who's moving, but the person next to you is moving. What would happen if the tree started to move? All of a sudden, no point of reference, no point of analysis. Is there any up or is there any down? So the philosophers tell us from level 1. The artists have told us from level 2, and it applies down right at level 3. But listen here to the philosopher at level 1, and I'm quoting Iris Murdoch. In one of her books, she's talking about Immanuel Kant's noble desire to find an ethic apart from God, that you can turn away from God and turn away from personal happiness and the force of the categorical imperatives. By dint of reason alone, you will be able to arrive at those laws and those rules by which you ought to live. Listen to how Iris Murdoch responds to Kant in his groundwork of ethics. See what she says. How recognizable, how familiar to us is the man so beautifully portrayed in the groundwork, who confronted even with Christ, turns away to consider the judgment of his own conscience and to hear the voice of his own reason. This man is with us still, free, independent, lovely, powerful, rational, responsible, brave, the hero of so many novels and books on moral philosophy. The raison d'etre of this attractive but misleading creature is not far to seek. He is the offspring of the age of science, confidently rational and yet increasingly aware of his alienation from the material universe which his discoveries reveal. His alienation is without cure. It is not such a long step from Kant to Nietzsche to existentialism and the Anglo-Saxon ethical doctrines which in some ways closely resemble it. In fact, Kant's man had already received a glorious incarnation nearly a century earlier in the work of Milton. His proper name is Lucifer. Here's a secular philosopher saying, it's not led us where we thought it would. And level 2, Steve Turner told us, if chance be the father of all flesh, disastrous as rainbow in the sky. You move from the logical incoherence to the artistic expression of it till it comes down in day-to-day living. And a philosopher of jurisprudence has said this: ours is an age where ethics has become obsolete. It is superseded by science, deleted by psychology, dismissed as emotive by philosophy. It is drowned in compassion, evaporates into aesthetics, and retreats before relativism. The usual moral distinctions between good and bad are simply drowned in a maudlin emotion in which we feel more sympathy for the murderer than for the murdered, for the adulterer than for the betrayed, and in which we have actually begun to believe that the real guilty party, the one who somehow caused it all, is the victim and not the perpetrator of the crime. So you move from the substructure of theoretical foundation where everything moves, no point of absolute anymore, and you work it through and take it through the century. And if there's anyone today who wants to hear of a moral absolute, let me tell you who that person is. It's the young child in Bosnia today who's asking the question, what does ethnic cleansing mean? What does justice really mean? Read the letters that 12, 13, 14-year-olds are writing in that country and wondering what has happened to us as a people. The moral law is dreadfully in jeopardy, and atheism has to examine its first principles. How are they going to deal with the relativism that it breeds? There is a second point of struggle that atheism faces existentially, and that is the struggle of finding meaning. How do I find meaning in my life? Some years ago, when I was doing a lectureship at the University of the Philippines in Manila, I remember at the end of one of my talks on humanity's search for meaning, a young man just jumped out of his chair. He wouldn't even wait till I could take a sip of water and give the ground rules for the question. He was obviously agitated all the way through and just screamed out. He said, I don't believe any of this. He said, everything in life is meaningless. Everything in life is meaningless. I said, you don't mean that. He said, of course I do. I said, no, you don't. He said, yes, I do. I said, no, you don't. He said, who are you to tell me I don't? I do. I said, all right, sir, please repeat that. He said, everything in life is meaningless. I said, you don't believe that. Now he was enraged. He said, I do. I said, remain standing. Let's interact for a moment. I said, I assume that you assumed that what you just said was meaningful. Is that right? He said, pardon? I said, you heard me. I said, I assume that you assumed that what you just said was meaningful. Is that right? And if what you just said was meaningful, then everything is not meaningless. On the other hand, if everything is meaningless, what you just said is meaningless too. In effect, you've said nothing. You can sit down. This is a similar type of game, by the way. They play with the laws of logic, which I will address tomorrow night, particularly when we get to the law of non-contradiction. But the funny part of it was the poor guy, as I'd finished and was walking away and the crowd had now dispersed, I saw this fellow standing in a corner, walking up and down, muttering to himself, if everything is meaningless, then what I just said was meaningless too. He was still trying to find a way out. So I said, you know, one of the most curious things about people who write about meaninglessness, I said, they write some of the fattest books, assuming that the books themselves are meaningful. But this search for meaning is real. Listen to how Muggeridge worded it, who'd lived in the media world. One of the great pleasures of my life, as I mentioned to you, was to have that day with him 7 months before Muggeridge passed away. One of the great journalists who had a brilliant ability with the pen and was able to create images with the pen so magnificently. And one eulogist described him as possibly the greatest British journalist of the 20th century. Listen to what he said. In this Sargasso sea of fantasy and fraud, how can I or anyone else hope to swim unencumbered? How can I learn to see through and not with the eye? How can I take off my own motley, wash away my makeup, raise the iron shutter and put out the studio lights, silence the sound effects and put the cameras to sleep, or watch the sunrise on Sunset Boulevard and set over Forest Lawn? Can I find furniture among the studio props, silence in a discotheque, love in a striptease, read truth of an autocue, catch it on a screen or chase it on the wings of Muzak? Can I view it in living color with the news, hear it in the living sound along the motorways, not in the wind that rent the mountains and broke in pieces the rocks, not in the earthquake that followed, nor in the fire that followed the earthquake, but in a still small voice, not in the screeching of tires either, or in the grinding of brakes, not in the roar of the jets or the whistle of sirens or the howl of trombones, the rattle of drums or the chanting of demo voices. Again and again and again, I say, that still small voice, if one could only find it. It was not at all surprising that later in his life, this peripatetic journalist who had lived such an indulgent, sensuous life, so that when you read his first volume of his autobiography, The Green Stick, A Chronicle of Wasted Years, you're almost embarrassed at some of the pages to see the indulgence of a man who was so perverted by his own description in his desires. But he said he found no reality out there, found only emptiness, found everything that was mock, till that still small voice of God, as he had found Christ in his own journey. And as we walked in his front garden, and he described the years that had gone by searching for meaning, he didn't have to describe it. You can walk through his rooms and see all of the paraphernalia and all of the pictures of the greats of this century whom he'd talked to and whom he'd interviewed, and come away with so hollow and so empty. This struggle for meaning. It's atheism's problem. Listen to how Stephen Jay Gould, the paleontologist from Harvard, says it, who's a confessed anti-theistic thinker. Listen to what he says. We are here because one odd group of fishes had a peculiar fin anatomy that could transform into legs for terrestrial creatures, because comets struck the earth and wiped out dinosaurs, thereby giving mammals a chance not otherwise available. So thank your lucky stars in a literal sense. Because the earth never froze entirely during an ice age, because a small and tenuous species arising in Africa 250,000 years ago has managed so far to survive by hook and by crook. We may yearn for a higher answer, but none exists. This explanation, though superficially troubling, if not terrifying, is ultimately liberating and exhilarating. We cannot read the meaning of life passively in the facts of nature. We must construct these answers ourselves from our own wisdom and from our own ethical sense. Very clearly stated, very poignantly stated. What I find fascinating is that again and again he talks about because, but then ultimately in some of his debates likes to deny causality itself in some of the arguments that we get into in his writings. The search for meaning, the longing for meaning, we see it come up again and again. But listen to what the counter perspective is. Here is, for example, a mathematical logician who says this in the Life magazine's publication on this issue of meaning. And I want to give this a fair hearing. Listen to what Raymond Smulyan says. I have always been extremely puzzled by those who have claimed that if there is no God, then life is meaningless. Is there the slightest shred of evidence that secular humanists find life less meaningful than do religious believers? I'm not claiming that there is no God, nor am I claiming that there is one. All I'm claiming is that life is extremely meaningful to most of those who live it, God or no God. I cannot help but think of the marvelous haiku, quote, quite apart from our religion, there are plum blossoms, there are cherry blossoms. I'd love to talk to Mr. Smulyan if I could. But a taxi driver did 2 pages over from his quote in New York City. I'd like to see what the mathematical logician would say to him. Listen to what he says. We're here to die, just to live and die. I live driving a cab. I do some fishing, take my girl out, pay taxes, do a little reading, then get ready to drop dead. You've got to be strong about it. Life is a big fake. Nobody gives a blank. You're rich or you're poor. You're here, you're gone. You're like the wind. After you're gone, other people will come. It's too late to make it better. Everyone's fed up. Can't believe in nothing no more. People have no pride. People have no fear. People aren't scared. People only care about one thing, and that's money. We're going to destroy ourselves. Nothing we can do about it. The only cure for the world's illness is nuclear war. Wipe everything out and start over. We've become like a concerned animal fighting for survival. Life is nothing. Where are the cherry blossoms in his life? I'm not saying that a person can find meaning apart from God. I'm asking you, where is the compelling reason for that meaning over anyone else's meaning? Why should a person's meaning be considered the meaning that I should follow if it is purely his whim or her whim? Sure, if life was only about enjoying cherry blossoms and apple blossoms, yes, but that's the aesthetic part of life. There is something a lot more than that. And it's not only the taxi driver, by the way. He said it with his murder of grammar and all of that. But Voltaire didn't. Voltaire said when he looked at life, this is what he saw. He saw a worm crawling on the earth and the bird going and destroying the worm and consuming it. Then he saw the eagle coming and destroying that bird. Then he saw a human being take his gun and shoot the eagle apart. And then the human being meets with this fellow human being on a battlefield and killing one another, and the worm enters that dead human being's body and devours that. He says the miseries of each are supposed to make up the good of all. What is the verdict of the vastest mind? He says silence. In that cyclical way, he himself sees meaninglessness and emptiness. And that cry for meaning is unshakable. Boris Becker, after he had won his Wimbledon, I think for the second time, when he was interviewed, was asked what are some of his greatest triumphs and his greatest fears. Boris Becker said, my greatest struggle is still wrestling with the fact as to why I don't commit suicide. Still battling the urge for suicide, this young man who was so triumphant in his tennis prowess. Jack Higgins, the author of many novels, was asked, what does he now know that he wished he'd known as a young man? And he said, I wished somebody had told me when I was a young man what I know so certainly now and didn't know then, that when you get to the top, there's nothing there. A few months ago, some of my colleagues and I were at the invitation of a huge Chinese tycoon in Hong Kong, a man who's one of the three wealthiest in Hong Kong. He and his partners had recently bought a property for $6 billion US. And we sat across a table, and I asked him outright as we began dinner, what led him in his journey ultimately to Christ. You know what he said? He said, the day came 18 months ago when I looked at my wife and I said to her, I want to say something to you that troubles me, and it's true. He said, I have all this money. I have attained every goal that I ever wanted to attain. I lack absolutely nothing. I'm a very wealthy man. Why am I so empty inside? Here's the first clue, ladies and gentlemen. We often think, as I said it last night, we often think that meaninglessness comes from being weary of pain. May I suggest to you, meaninglessness comes not from being weary of pain, but from being weary of pleasure. What do you do when you've exhausted every pleasure? When you've enjoyed every appeal to the senses? And I'm not the one who makes those ideas up. Listen, for example, to that short story by Camus called The Adulterous Woman, where he talks about a man and a woman who lived in a small village, and he took her into a city for the first time to sell his diamonds. And she is now enthralled with the big city that she's seeing for the first time. The husband says, why don't you walk around? I'll go and sell my diamonds and come. And he leaves her alone. And she's looking at the stores, and then all of a sudden the allurements of the big city. And now she thinks of passions that she had as a younger woman, which she had never indulged in, and wondered what it would be like if she could express them. She thinks, this is the moment, the big city is here, my husband is not here, I can engage in any passion I dreamed about and longed for and never experienced. But she's fearful that if she gets found out, what will that mean in the home? So she's ambivalent and struggles and is not able to make that decision. The husband comes back, they go to the hotel room at the end of the day, and they have a dinner and settle into the bed at night. He is sound asleep within moments. She's still lying awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering, is this going to be the moment that I can go out and enjoy the lust of the night? While he's sound asleep, she gets changed, goes out into the night, and comes back with him being totally unaware of her absence. She's enjoyed whatever it was she longed for. She comes back into the room and gets changed again and slips under the covers. Now she is still awake, but for a different reason. The heart is pounding harder than it did before the experience. Now she is living with a different sensation. She gradually feels the eyes filling up with tears, and the tears then begin to run down the side of the face, till she sits up in bed and cries with uncontrollable sobs. The husband wakes up and says, what's the matter? What's the matter? And she just shrugs him off and says, nothing, just nothing. The loneliest moment in life is when you have just experienced that which you thought would deliver the ultimate, and it has let you down. There's a first clue that meaninglessness is not there because we have all the suffering, as real as it is, and we'll address that hopefully as we deal with the issue from the theistic perspective tomorrow. But the fact of the matter is that the reality of pleasure after pleasure after pleasure, pain after pain after pain, the emptiness is there more after pleasure has been indulged in. And let me just introduce you to one simple clue, because it'll give me the building block on which I can begin my answers tomorrow, and my remaining 2 thoughts here, I promise, will be brief. I remember coming back from Cambodia years ago after preaching there, and I'd been gone 5 weeks. I had to stay there that length because the country was on the verge of falling. And I'd covered the length of that country, spoken to large audiences, which it was an avowedly atheistic country, and some marvelous things had happened as they were turning their hearts towards God once more, as is happening in the former Soviet Union today. But I recall when I came back home so weary, I was emotionally wrung out. You gave so much and you lived with such fear night after night, with doors often being rattled. And so I was emotionally strained through it all. But I remember as my wife picked me up at the airport when we lived in Toronto at that time, and she took me over to her mother's home where she had kept our little girl Naomi, who was still in a walker, and I had not seen her for 5 weeks now. How I desperately missed her. And as I walked into the kitchen, my eyes just gazed upon her chubby little cheeks, her cute little countenance, as she stared at me. In fact, I've often said when she was born, her cheeks were so fat that it made her eyes look like an afterthought. And there she was, with hair that just shot out at a 45-degree angle. We could never get it to rest. She was holding on to her walker, this tiny little creature, and she stared at me, leveled her gaze at me. I wondered if she was processing in her mind, who is this man? I've seen him before. And as I put my arms out, she just raced towards me, almost stumbling over herself, and shot her arms out. And I wrapped my arms around her, clutched her for about a minute as she just nestled at my neck. And in those 60 seconds to a couple minutes, the emotions just swarmed within me. I got another clue to what life's meaning is all about. Lee Iacocca put it well. He said, "Here I am in the twilight years of my life, still wondering what it's all about. I can say this," he said, "fame and fortune are for the birds." And then he talks about what he has learned from just pouring his affection into his children and what he has learned from their affection into them. I just leave you with that clue that there are intimations of reality that may not come from sophisticated academic textbooks, that may not come even from any poet or lyricist, although they come crowding in again and again if you read enough of them, that there's something in life that yearns for coherence, that yearns for beyond the 80 years and 10. In fact, even Immanuel Kant admitted in his second preface to the Groundworks, he said he came to the conclusion that as much as he was pontificating the idea of a rationalistic ethic, it became a very tedious task to separate ethics from purpose. Purpose is interwoven to any definition of ethic, and it is purpose that brings meaning. How well I recall standing beside of a young woman in her 20s who was dying of AIDS, a tragic sight in a city, as she had asked if I would come and visit her. And I remember putting my arms around her, embracing her before I'd left. Never met her before, but she had heard some tapes and lectures and books, and read some books and asked if I would come and visit. Through one fateful error, evidently, so unfortunate, she had destroyed that resistance system in her body. And what was fascinating as I bent down to give her a hug before I left was to see on her coffee table a book. The cover on the book said, "The Hunger for Significance." A hunger for significance. Even in her dying moments, that was her yearning. Could I find significance even in this state? Atheism struggles with giving the moral law, struggles with giving meaning. Thirdly and quickly, it struggles with giving hope. Wasn't it Camus who said, "Death is philosophy's only problem"? Well, it's a pretty big problem. It defines everything else. Job said to God when he was struggling in pain, "If a man die, will he live again?" If any one of you has ever stood by the graveside of a loved one, I don't have to explain for you the question that is raised, the struggle that you feel. What happens to a human being when he or she dies? The longing for hope because we do know this, and at least we are agreed on this, that if there is an answer beyond the grave, then there is a key to interpreting life. It ought to be a given. And of course, all nihilists and atheists will deny, as Madeleine Murray O'Hair said, that there is nothing beyond the grave. As I think Hobbes said, the worms will devour my body and I commit my soul to the great perhaps. Bertrand Russell said all of his ideals would come crashing in disaster at the end of his own existence, as it were. That optimism or whatever ends when the person himself or herself ceases to be. So there is a longing for hope. But atheism, there's no point of reference for an absolute moral law, no meaning, no hope, and ultimately and fascinatingly, it was here that I believe Pascal said it so simply and said it so well. He pointed out the very clear problem of what happens if an atheist is wrong, and it's an argument that has been so misunderstood. So let me read it and close with an illustration here. He said this: should a man be in error in supposing the Christian religion to be true, he could not be a loser by mistake. But how irreparable is his loss, and how inexpressible his danger, should he err in supposing it to be false. Here's that Pascalian wager. Should a man be in error in supposing the Christian religion to be true, he could not be a loser by mistake. But how irreparable is his loss, and how inexpressible his danger, who should err in supposing it to be false. Now this wager has sort of been dismissed as a kind of a wish thinking, a kind of a last gasp approach, that even if I'm wrong, no big deal. That's really not what Pascal is saying here. What Pascal is saying is, these are two opposing views, God's existence and non-existence. One view of God's existence incorporates the key to life's meaning in the other person's existence too. In other words, if fulfillment, expression, progress, using reason, pursuing excellence, doing the best, going to your fullest potential is what the anti-theistic thinker wants to live for in the best sense of the term, the theist still has that. But he says, if when I die, I am become into nothing, then that which I'd hoped beyond the grave would obviously not be there for me. But I lost nothing in life because I met that person's test for life's meaning too. But if that person has, on conjecture and whatever reason, built his or her whole life on the non-existence of God, and that turns out to be wrong, how inexpressible is his or her loss. That's the point he's making, that the one meets the other test and has its own a greater one. This one loses the ultimate investment of life itself in finding out that that commitment had been to a wrong way of thinking. And so I say, as I close here, that when Nietzsche wrote those words, is there any up or down left? What games will we need to invent? In a tragic way, in an almost self-fulfilling prophecy, he spent the last 13 years of his life in and out of an insane asylum setting. His mother sat next to him for day after day after day. And days on end he would be absolutely quiet, and many times burst out then into the scriptures that he had learned as a younger man. But he said, universal madness will break out, and the 20th century will become the bloodiest century in history. And we see that turning out to be true. And you have it with an atheistic worldview, no law, no meaning, no hope, and if it turns out to be wrong, no recovery. I began with quoting Ed Ames. Listen to the words of Justin Hayward in the Moody Blues, also in the 60s. Why do we never get an answer when we are knocking at the door with 1,000 million questions about hate and death and war? Because when we stop and look around us, there is nothing that we need in a world of persecution that is whirling in its greed. Why do we never get an answer when we're knocking at the door? And then this, I'm looking for someone to change my life. I'm looking for a miracle in my life. I believe God can bring that answer and that miracle, and that'll be our subject for tomorrow evening. Thank you so much for being patient. I appreciate it.
A sobering final thought from Ravi Zacharias in his message, Ravi Answers Atheists. As we mentioned at the start of the broadcast, these points are not to help you win an argument with an unbeliever. They're meant to answer serious questions posed by those who want reasons to believe. Our concern should always be first for them. If you'd like to get a copy of this message, we invite you to call us toll-free at 1-800-448-6766. That's 1-800-448-6766. And the title again is Ravi Answers Atheists. You can also order online at rzim.org. And while you're there, browse our extensive library of resources and request our free daily email, A Slice of Infinity. If this topic of answering atheists is one that interests you, let me suggest you order the book The Real Face of Atheism. Whether disguised in Eastern mysticism or American consumerism, the true nature of atheism is a world without God. In this thought-provoking book, Ravi Zacharias examines atheistic positions on human nature, the meaning of life, morality, and death, and offers a clear apologetic for the Christian faith. The Real Face of Atheism is a compelling text both for those who want to improve their apologetic knowledge and those who are skeptical and searching. And you can find it and more online at rzim.org.